He never meant for the moment to become a spectacle, yet it did quietly, brutally, and with enough force that the entire training yard seemed to stop breathing. Midday sun baked the concrete, shimmering like a heat, forged blade, and Marines gathered in lazy clusters, half bored, half restless, waiting for their next drill. Then she walked across the yard, small, quiet, unnoticed by most. A woman with a simple tote bag slung over her shoulder, her expression unreadable. That alone was enough for Private First Class Rourke to smirk. He nudged the Marine beside him, eyes narrowing with the kind of arrogance born from never having been truly humbled. He stepped into her path with an easy swagger, as though he was offering a harmless joke, but the silence that followed suggested something far less innocent. "Call sign," he said lightly, expecting laughter from the others, expecting her to blush, stutter, or hurry off in confusion. She didn't. She simply looked at him, a faint, unreadable calm settling over her features, as if his question was a puzzle she had already solved long ago. The Marines leaned in not out of interest, but out of the thrill of watching someone cornered. Before she answered, something shifted in the air around them. A subtle drop in temperature, a tightening of the space, the way tension coils before a storm. Rourke didn't see it, but others did. The subtle marks on her knuckles, the quiet weight of someone accustomed to danger, the invisible gravity that clung to her presence like an echo from another life. Still, Rourke pressed on, smiling wider, mistaking silence for fragility. Behind him, a group of Marines slowed their stride, drawn to the brewing moment. Not because they expected violence. She didn't look like violence. She looked ordinary, forgettable, the kind of person a crowd overlooks even when searching for her. But the way she held his stare, unblinking, unafraid, made something in their instincts rattle. "You heard me?" Rourke added with a chuckle, still trying to make his voice carry confidence. "Call sign, or do you not have one?" He wanted the men around him to laugh, to nod, to reward him with the kind of social approval that mattered far too much to him. But nobody laughed. Something about her stillness felt wrong, too controlled, too measured. She finally drew a quiet breath, steady and slow, like someone accustomed to choosing every word with precision. And when she answered, her voice was soft, but it carried through the yard as if carried on steel. "Black Mamba." For a heartbeat, no one reacted. The name drifted into the open air, curling through the space, slipping past the Marines like a whisper that struck bone. Rourke blinked, as though he hadn't heard correctly, but the men behind him did. A shiver passed through one of them. Another swallowed hard. A third took a subtle step back, instinct guiding him before reason caught up. Black Mamba wasn't a call sign people joked about. It wasn't even spoken aloud in most circles. It was a warning, a myth, a shadow carved from real missions and whispered rumors. No one knew her face, but everyone knew the stories. The operative who didn't miss, didn't hesitate, didn't fail. Someone who vanished into war zones and left behind only the aftermath. She wasn't simple. She wasn't harmless. And she absolutely wasn't someone you stepped in front of for amusement. Rourke tried to laugh, but the sound caught in his throat as the truth began to ripple through the group. Eyes widened, postures shifted, and the Marine who had just mocked her felt heat rise up his spine like a silent threat. She didn't move, didn't gloat, didn't assert dominance. She simply waited, watching him with a calmness that unsettled something primal inside him. In that moment, the yard felt suspended, caught between the arrogance of a man who didn't know better and the quiet, coiled potential of a woman who knew far too much. A tremor of realization rippled through the Marines like a silent shockwave, but Rourke clung to denial the way a drowning man clings to driftwood. His mind rejected the possibility, rewriting what he'd heard. She was too ordinary, too young, too unassuming. Legends weren't supposed to look like people you could pass in a grocery line without noticing. Yet there she stood, unbothered by the accusation in his stare, as if she had grown accustomed to men underestimating her. His smirk faltered, reshaping itself into something stiff, something forced. "Black Mamba," he repeated, not as a question but as an accusation, as though he hoped saying it again would make it sound ridiculous. But the name settled heavily in the air, refusing to dissolve. The Marines around him shifted uneasily. Some glanced at each other, as if confirming they'd all heard the same thing. The distant hum of generators, the rhythmic clank of metal against metal, everything seemed to dim beneath the weight of her presence. She didn't move, but there was a subtle change in her posture, the kind of effortless grounding that belonged to someone who wasn't threatened, only patient. Her gaze softened almost imperceptibly, not in kindness, but in recognition. She had seen this exact expression on countless faces before. The slow dawning of respect born too late. Rourke opened his mouth to speak, but before he could gather whatever apology or bravado he intended, a veteran Marine stepped forward from the circle. His bronzed face carried years of dust, smoke, and memory, the kind of man who rarely reacted to anything. Yet his expression now held unmistakable caution. He addressed Rourke without taking his eyes off her. "You don't know who you're talking to," he murmured, the warning so low it felt carved instead of spoken. Rourke stiffened. The quiet murmur spread like a spark, passing from Marine to Marine until a silent ring formed not to protect her, but to distance themselves from his mistake. Several lowered their gaze, not in fear, but in humility. Even those who prided themselves on skepticism couldn't ignore the unspoken truth vibrating through the group. Across the yard, another figure approached, an older gunnery sergeant, tall and rigid, his stride driven by discipline rather than urgency. But when his eyes fell on her, something loosened in his jaw, a barely perceptible shift that only came from recognition. He stopped 2 steps short, studying her with the precision of someone scanning for ghosts. "You're off duty," she said gently, surprising everyone with her softness. Sergeant nodded once, but his respect was unmistakable. Rourke's heart hammered against his ribs, but pride trapped him in place. "So what?" he muttered, trying to salvage the collapsing image of himself. "She's just—" "Don't finish that sentence," the sergeant said, not raising his voice, not taking a single intimidating step forward. Yet the command felt colder than winter steel. Rourke swallowed hard. He didn't understand why the air suddenly felt thinner, why a strange heat crawled up the back of his neck, why some Marines looked at him not with mockery but with pity. He turned back to her, searching for something: humility, anger, vulnerability, anything that made sense. But she remained absolutely still, her serenity more unnerving than any threat could have been. "What did you do?" he asked quietly, almost whispering now, his bravado shattered by the crushing silence. She exhaled slowly, the breath steadying her before she answered. "My job," she said, nothing more, but the simplicity of those 2 words cut deeper than a confession. It carried undertones of broken borders, night raids, classified recoveries missions that had shaped corridors of whispered stories far beyond her control. The Marines didn't need details. Her reputation wasn't built on tales she retold, but on the fear of those who had survived encountering her. Rourke felt something foreign sting behind his ribs, a mixture of shame and awe. He wanted to step back, to apologize, to disappear, but his feet stayed rooted in place, anchored by the weight of his mistake. The sergeant shifted, exhaling slowly. "Black Mamba doesn't boast," he said. "She buries stories she never asked to live." The yard fell silent again, thick with a reverence Rourke didn't understand yet, but would soon. Rourke had no way of knowing how quickly a person's world could shrink, but the realization settled on him with suffocating clarity as he watched her turn slightly, adjusting the tote bag on her shoulder. A simple motion, unthreatening, yet the shift revealed the faint outline of an old scar along her wrist, thin, pale, almost elegant in how mercilessly it contradicted her quiet demeanor. Old wounds have a way of revealing truth. This one struck Rourke harder than any reprimand ever had. He remembered hearing pieces of rumors during boot camp, fragments murmured late at night when recruits tried to scare each other with exaggerated stories. A specter of a woman who moved through enemy lines like smoke, whose mere mention could silence a room. Someone the brass protected, not because she needed it, but because countless classified operations hinged on her anonymity. But myths were easy to dismiss until one stared you down with steady, unflinching eyes. The gunnery sergeant cleared his throat, but his gaze never left her. He was searching for something familiar, a confirmation that the legend was flesh and blood before him. And when he found it, a small, nearly invisible flicker of recognition, his posture shifted from caution to respect. The kind of respect that can't be taught, only earned in places drenched in sand, fear, and the echoes of choices no one wants to remember. "You still carry the weight alone?" he said quietly, almost to himself. She didn't deny it. She simply lowered her eyes for a brief moment, the first sign of vulnerability she had allowed into the open. The Marines around them felt something shift, a subtle unraveling of the mystery, not an explanation, but a reminder that even legends bleed inside. Rourke's breathing grew shallow as a deeper truth took shape. He had not merely disrespected a superior in experience. He had mocked someone who carried a burden far heavier than any rank he could earn. Shame throbbed in his throat, a bitter knot he couldn't swallow. "What were you thinking?" one Marine whispered to him, not cruelly, not mockingly, but with genuine disbelief. Rourke didn't answer. He couldn't. She noticed his inner collapse long before he acknowledged it himself. Her gaze softened not in forgiveness, but in understanding. She had seen men crumble under worse circumstances. She knew the tremor of ego buckling under truth. And rather than turn away, she stepped toward him. It was only one step, yet it silenced the yard even further. The other Marines expected reprimand, a sharp correction, perhaps even a verbal strike that would leave him staggering. But when she reached him, she stopped at a distance respectful enough to avoid cornering him. "You didn't know," she said. 3 words, not absolution, not dismissal, simply fact. Rourke felt the weight of them settle into his bones. Ignorance wasn't an excuse, but it was a starting point. Still, he couldn't bring himself to lift his head. Her voice softened with a calm strength that felt foreign in an environment built on barked orders. "The name you joked about was earned where light doesn't reach. It isn't something I wear, it's something I survived." A ripple of emotion passed through the crowd, discomfort, sorrow, reverence. Even the sergeant lowered his gaze, humbled by the honesty she rarely allowed anyone to witness. Rourke felt the world tilt. His arrogance, once worn like armor, cracked in a way he couldn't conceal. He swallowed, words failing him, pride resisting even in defeat. She didn't make him finish, learning. She said simply, a statement, not a consolation. A quiet wind swept through the yard then, pushing dust across their boots, shifting the heat, soaked silence into something calmer. For the first time, Rourke noticed how steady her breathing was, how anchored she seemed in the center of the tension she had neither created nor escalated. A Marine from the back stepped forward. He had a limp, the kind earned from a mission that remained classified long after the medals had tarnished. When he looked at her, admiration softened his hardened eyes. "You saved half a squad in Helmand," he murmured. "Dragged them out under fire." She didn't confirm it. She didn't deny it. Her silence was its own answer. Rourke stared at her with a tightening in his chest, realizing that he had reduced a lifetime of sacrifice into a flippant, careless question. But beneath his shame flickered something else: respect, not the ceremonial kind, but the kind that transforms a man from within. The sergeant inhaled deeply. "We owe her more than stories," he said. "We owe her truth." Rourke understood then that the confrontation wasn't about rank, reputation, or legend. It was about recognizing the humanity behind the myth, something fragile, fierce, and undeservedly solitary. And part of him wondered if she had ever been treated as anything else. The stillness that settled over the yard was different now, no longer charged with tension, but weighed down by a collective reckoning. The Marines weren't looking at a legend anymore. They were looking at a woman who had lived through the kind of nights that steal pieces of a person's soul. Some understood fragments of her history. Others understood only the gravity of how little they understood. But all of them felt the quiet shift inside themselves. Rourke's pulse still hammered, but the edge of panic had faded into something rawer. He finally forced himself to lift his head, searching her face as if hoping to find condemnation there. Instead, he found a kind of tired clarity, someone accustomed to being misjudged, underestimated, quietly dismissed, until the truth broke through against her will. "Why don't you correct people?" he asked softly, voice unsteady, the question escaping before he could guess it. A flicker of emotion crossed her features, so subtle it might have been imagined, because the world listens only when it chooses to, she said. "And explaining yourself to those who mock you is a battle not worth fighting." The words cut through him like a blade made of something colder than steel. Perspective. He swallowed hard, feeling his spine straighten in an instinctive attempt to stand with some semblance of dignity. But dignity had little to do with posture. It lived in the heart, and his had been cracked open. The gunnery sergeant stepped closer to her, lowering his voice. "You shouldn't be carrying it alone," he murmured. "Not anymore." She glanced up at him, and for a brief, flickering second, her eyes betrayed something deeper. A wound stitched together so many times it had become part of her. But she didn't dwell on it. She simply nodded once, a silent acknowledgement between warriors who shared the same ghosts. Then she turned back to Rourke. The young Marine felt the heat of humiliation still burning, but he refused to look away again. "I'm sorry," he whispered, not as a formality, not as a script, but as a confession dragged from the core of him. She didn't offer forgiveness. She offered something harder, something more valuable. "Then be better," she said. "For the ones who never came home, for the ones who still bear the weight. That's how you repay your mistakes." Her words sank into him like sunlight breaking through storm clouds, illuminating things he hadn't yet learned about himself. He nodded, the motion small but sincere, but the moment wasn't finished. From across the yard, an older lieutenant, one whose decades in service had carved stories into the lines around his eyes, walked toward the group. His gaze landed on her first. Recognition hit him like a physical force. His breath caught. "I'll be damned," he whispered, emotion threading his voice. "I thought you were gone." She didn't flinch. "Parts of me are," she replied quietly. The lieutenant lowered his gaze in reverence, not sorrow. "They said Black Mamba disappeared after the border incident. They said you wouldn't come back." Her eyes softened. "I came back, just not the same." Something in that answer shifted the entire atmosphere. The Marines around them understood now. She wasn't a myth returning to prove a point. She was a survivor returning to live without one. Rourke watched her with a respect so profound it felt like a new language forming inside him. He understood now why the others had stepped back, why even the sergeant had softened, why her silence carried more weight than any rank. She had lived through a world he had only seen in training simulations. She had walked into the worst of humanity and walked out alone. No medals pinned to her chest, no parades celebrating her return, just the burden that came with being too good at saving others to save herself. She shifted the tote bag on her shoulder again. "I'm only here to pick up medical forms," she said, reminding them gently that she hadn't come to be honored, confronted, or recognized. She simply wanted to live quietly, but legends rarely get that choice. The lieutenant stepped aside. "You walk through this base with respect now," he said, his voice carrying an order none dared challenge. She nodded once, then began to walk away. The Marines parted instinctively, forming a path, not out of fear, but out of reverence. Rourke stepped back, watching her pass, the lesson carved into his chest so deeply he knew it would never fade. And in that moment he understood that bravery wasn't loud, power wasn't boastful. True strength was quiet enough that only those listening closely ever saw it. As she walked toward the admin building, the sun cast her shadow long across the concrete, a silhouette, both ordinary and legendary. A woman who looked simple until the world learned her truth. To them, she would always be Black Mamba, but to herself she was just someone trying to breathe again.